The deconstructionist stage. The lecture hall vibrated with a hushed, expectant energy. Professor Armitage, perpetually cloaked in tweed and a world-weary air, adjusted his microphone with a melodramatic sigh. The projector whirred, splashing a screen print across the wall. A celebrity visage, fragmented and repeated into numbing abstraction reminiscent of Warhol. Observe, Armitage's voice, a parched gravel, somehow filled the room. The modern idol, taken apart, reassembled, yet, in the end, empty. He let the pronouncement linger, a cloud of intellectual smog. We, my bright pupils, are the dismantlers. We dissect these deities, expose the flimsy framework propping up the shimmering facade, and reveal the stark void beneath. A ripple of uneasy laughter fluttered through the assembly. Armitage cultivated this disquiet. It was his intellectual fertilizer. He fed on others' discomfort, mistaking it for engagement. With a dismissive wave, he indicated the screen. Consider this era's fixation on renown, the relentless chase for fame, the hollow declarations passing as wisdom, the faces sculpted by surgery, grinning from glossy pages. He paused, his gaze roving, snagging for a heartbeat on a latecomer settling into a back row seat. It is purely and simply a societal mania. The new arrival, registered as John Barron, kept his gaze lowered, absorbed by the scarred surface of the desk. The room held an unexpected chill, the air thick with the scent of dust and forgotten lore. He felt the burdensome weight of his alias, an ill-fitting disguise. He regulated his breathing, battling the nervous tremor in his chest. His purpose here was to observe, to learn, to decipher. That Armitage's harangue intensified, his voice gaining velocity. We are bombarded with visions of unattainable flawlessness, ideals fabricated in the sterile studios of Hollywood and the strategic dens of Madison Avenue. We're urged to excel, to maximize our potential, all while being subtly, insidiously reminded that we're inherently insufficient. Be best. The slogan echoed in John's mind. He understood its genesis, its motivation. He recalled the countless hours invested in its execution, the genuine aspiration to promote kindness and combat cyber-bullying. Here perverted, twisted into a cynical weapon, struck him like a blow. He lifted his head, his eyes locking with Armitage's for a fleeting, unnerving moment. The professor's scrutiny was keen, almost predatory. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, yet John felt a nagging sense of recognition. Armitage clicked a remote, replacing the image with a montage of pictures, a precisely maintained garden, an expensive handbag, a shiny magazine cover featuring a radiant woman in couture. The images seemed disparate, arbitrarily chosen, yet John felt a clutch in his throat. Contemplate the symbols, Armitage drawled, his tone steeped in derision. The meticulously constructed presentation, the purposeful unveiling of aspirational emptiness. He paused for effect. The unspoken promise that joy is purchasable, that contentment resides in the attainment of possessions. Some students scribbled notes with fervor, desperate to capture Armitage's pronouncements. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing a current of malice in his words. We are told to mimic these figures, to strive for their level of shallowness. Armitage's lips twisted into a sneer. We are goaded into believing that style equates to substance, that facade is reality. John's hands tightened into fists beneath the desk, that he understood the realities behind those images, the tireless effort, the commitment to philanthropy, the sincere strivings to enact positive change. He knew the constant scrutiny, the relentless censure, the pressure to adhere to impossible ideals. Armitage's lecture continued, a nonstop downpour of cynicism and subtly disguised jabs. He dismantled the parlance of self-help gurus, lampooned the customs of celebrity culture, and ridiculed the pursuit of personal branding. Each thrust, each sardonic remark, felt like a personalized assault. He moved into a discussion of social media, decrying the ascendance of influencers and the disintegration of genuine connection. We exist in an era of performative activism, he proclaimed, his voice rising with scorn. where gestures are confused with authentic action, where hashtags stand in for heartfelt compassion. He pressed the remote again, showcasing a screenshot of a tweet promoting an anti-bullying campaign. John recognized the familiar blue verification mark. The carefully phrased message, a wave of protectiveness surged through him, a primal need to defend the individual being targeted. Note the irony. Armitage spat, his voice saturated with venom. The self-declared champion of kindness, the peddler of pleasantries, the embodiment of hypocrisy. The room's atmosphere felt thick, suffocating. John could feel his face flushing, his pulse pounding. He battled the urge to rise, to shout, to defend the person he cherished. But he remained still, his eyes glued to the worn wood of the desk. He was John Barron now, an outsider, an auditor. He needed to remain detached, neutral. Yet, as Armitage's invective continued echoing through the sterile lecture hall, John knew that maintaining that distance was becoming progressively untenable. Deconstructionist was erecting a stage and was about to unleash a drama with far-reaching consequences. The bell shattered Armitage's diatribe like a broken cord. Students began gathering their belongings, eager to flee the poisonous air. John pushed himself to his feet, his movements forced and controlled. He steered clear of Armitage's gaze, fixing his attention on the exit. Reaching the doorway, he hesitated, casting a quick glance back at the professor. Armitage watched him, his expression enigmatic. A flicker of comprehension, or perhaps amusement, danced in his eyes. John pivoted and exited the hall, leaving the deconstructionist platform behind, but a growing sense of foreboding told him the performance was far from over. The curtain had barely risen. Whispers and shadows. Armitage stalked the stage's confines like a restless predator. The time-worn floorboards sighing beneath his leather shoes, he adjusted his spectacles, the action bordering on a calculated performance. And then we have the modern marvel of, "Be best," he drawled, the words laced with contempt. The tremor of unease rippled through the lecture hall. Such a weighty addition to our national dialogue, a veritable lighthouse of intellectual fortitude in these turbulent times. He paused, letting the sarcasm saturate the air. One can't help but wonder, can one, if the most beneficial result would have been quietude? John Barron's fingers dug into the desk's edge. The synthetic surface starkly cold against his skin. He willed himself to breathe evenly, deliberately. This was a setup. He felt it in his bones. The veiled barbs, the meticulously crafted derision, too pointed to be accidental. Impassivity was key. Invisibility, paramount. The room's atmosphere felt heavy, thick with a peculiar blend of trepidation and eagerness. Armitage pressed on, his inflection climbing. We elevate these individuals, these totems, to pedestals they haven't earned. We scrutinize their utterances as if they were sacred texts, searching for sense where none exist. What end? Approval. Acceptance. He waved a dismissive hand, as if scattering dust. It's pathetic, utterly, irredeemably so. A hand shot up from the audience, belonging to a young man with meticulously styled hair and a self-satisfied smirk. "Professor," he began, his tone dripping with affected knowingness. Couldn't one argue that Be Best was, in fact, a masterstroke of strategy? I mean, who'd suspect someone with that particular elocution of being a Machiavellian mastermind? The laughter was immediate and cutting, but a jolt of raw fury surged through Barron, threatening to crack his carefully constructed composure. His grip tightened, knuckles bone white. The blood roared in his ears, eclipsing the sounds of the room. He forced his gaze upward, taking stock. Most of the students were consumed by laughter, their faces twisted in expressions of smug superiority. The scattering appeared uneasy, their eyes flitting about nervously. And Armitage was watching him, a predatory glint in his eye. Barron returned the look, his own face a study in neutrality. He would not afford him the satisfaction of a reaction. Let him believe he was simply another disinterested student, passively absorbing the poison. Let him underestimate him at his peril. The laughter faded, replaced by a charged silence. The student who'd cracked the joke fidgeted. His smirk, now less assured, he seemed to realize he'd overstepped, even if he couldn't quite articulate why. Armitage cleared his throat, his gaze never leaving Barron. "Indeed, Mr. Johnson," he said, his eyes scanning the class list. "A compelling proposition. Perhaps a future discussion could delve into the social-linguistic ramifications of influence and perceived linguistic aptitude." A ghost of a smile played on his lips. "However, for now, let us return to the core issue, the perils of blind faith." Barron remained mute, his gaze unwavering. He was certain that Armitage sought to provoke a slip, to unmask his true identity, to furnish the ammunition for a full-blown assault. But he would not yield. He would play the waiting game, adhere to the protocols, and await his own moment to act. The lecture continued, but the atmosphere had undergone a transformation. The air vibrated with unspoken tension, a silent power struggle unfolding beneath the veneer of scholarly exchange. Barron could feel the scrutiny of his classmates, their eyes like probes, attempting to decipher his response. He was acutely aware that his very silence spoke volumes, that his carefully maintained anonymity was beginning to fray. As the lecture neared its close, Barron gathered his belongings. His movements measured and deliberate, he carefully avoided any visual contact with Armitage. Focusing instead on maneuvering through the crowded space, he felt the heat of the professor's gaze on his back, like a brand. Outside, the sinking sun cast elongated shadows across the verdant campus. Barron drew a deep breath, the crisp autumn air refreshing his senses. He required clarity, a strategy, a means of shielding himself and those under his protection from Armitage's unrelenting advance. That he quickened his pace, his footsteps echoing rhythmically along the pathway. From behind, he detected whispers, the muffled speculation concerning his origins, his aspirations, his connection to the burgeoning conflict. He was no longer cloaked in shadows. He was a marked man, and Armitage was closing the distance. The question of empathy. The aroma of aged parchment and smoldering Cavendish hung heavy in Armitage's study, a spectral presence refusing to dissipate. Sunlight, strained by the grimy window overlooking the campus green, illuminated drifting particles of dust. Barron halted just inside the threshold, acutely aware of the palpable tension simmering between them. The room was a crammed testament to scholarly pursuits. Books overstuffed the shelves, threatening to spill into the room. Precariously balanced stacks of assignments, rings from forgotten mugs bloom across the desk surface like strange lichen. "Professor Armitage," Barron's voice, carefully controlled, sliced through the stillness. Armitage stooped over a text, raised his head with a sigh that could sour cream. His eyes, magnified by thick lenses, held a flash of either wry amusement or a deliberate provocation. "Mr. Barron, what brings you to my humble abode? I had rather hoped my lecture on performative activism had sated your intellectual appetite." Barron sidestepped the jibe. "Actually, sir, I wish to discuss your interpretation of empathy as it relates to contemporary political discourse." He edged further into the room, wary of upsetting the precarious towers of paper. Armitage settled back in his squeaking chair, forming a steeple with his fingers. "Empathy, is it? A treacherous thing, Barron. Frequently mistaken for weakness. These days, it is more likely to be exploited than returned. But isn't the capacity to grasp another's viewpoint vital for any true exchange?" Barron parried, drawing up a time-worn chair. The springs cried out in protest. "Even amidst profound disagreement, shouldn't we strive to understand their perspective?" Armitage offered a rasping chuckle, like pebbles grinding together. "Ah, the seductive promise of understanding. How beautifully idealistic. Tell me, Mr. Barron, do you extend this empathy to those determined to dismantle the very bedrock of a just society? Do you feel for the disseminators of falsehoods, the architects of inequity?" Barron hesitated, choosing each word with care. "I believe in understanding the motivations underpinning their actions, even as I condemn the actions themselves. Without it, we're simply broadcasting into the void." Armitage's gaze intensified. And what lofty motivations do you attribute to, say, those who amass wealth from division? What deep-seated anguish fuels their relentless grab for power? He paused, letting the question resonate. Educate me, Mr. Barron. Barron met Armitage's penetrating stare, unwavering. Perhaps fear motivates them. Perhaps a perception of being ignored, marginalized. Perhaps a misguided conviction that their actions ultimately serve the greater good, however distorted that notion may be. Armitage snorted derisively. Fear, the powerful, trembling in apprehension. A captivating theory. And this misguided conviction, does that excuse the corrosion of truth, the vilification of entire populations? He reached for his pipe, carefully packing the bowl with tobacco. The resulting aroma, once lit, was bitter and pungent. I'm not excusing anything, Barron countered firm. I'm simply suggesting that unraveling the underlying causes of these behaviors, however abhorrent, represents the initial stride toward addressing them effectively. Addressing them? Armitage exhaled a cloud of smoke towards the ceiling. My dear Barron, you appear to believe that a polite conversation over tea will magically transform the hearts of entrenched ideologues. Reality operates differently. Some individuals are simply beyond redemption. Some conflicts demand a ruthlessness that precludes empathy. But isn't that precisely the mindset that perpetuates the endless cycle of conflict? Barron pressed, his tone hardening slightly. If we refuse even the attempt at understanding, aren't we simply stoking the flames? Armitage leaned forward, his eyes glittering with something akin to pity. You're young, Barron. You still embrace the naive concept that inherent goodness resides in everyone, that reason and compassion shall ultimately triumph, that you'll discover, in time, that some are purely driven by malevolence, by an insatiable hunger for dominance. And against such forces, empathy becomes a liability, not a defense. He tapped his pipe against the desk's edge, scattering ash. A vulnerability they will ruthlessly exploit. Barron rose to his feet, the chair's legs screeching against the floor, the sound amplified in the confined space. I respectfully disagree, Professor, that I believe empathy constitutes the only genuine path to breaking the cycle, forging connections instead of erecting barriers. Armitage observed him, a ghost of a smile playing upon his lips. A commendable sentiment, Barron. Entirely impractical, yet commendable all the same. Now, if you'll pardon me, I have papers awaiting evaluation. Essays brimming with the same well-intentioned, though fundamentally misguided, idealism. It's a blight upon the academic landscape. He returned to his manuscript, dismissing Barron with a flick of his wrist. Barron lingered momentarily, then turned and departed the office, the scent of old paper and pipe tobacco clinging to him. But he knew he hadn't converted Armitage. Yet he had sown a seed, a minuscule seed of doubt, within the professor's fertile cynicism. And sometimes that sufficed. Unmasking. Barron hesitated at the threshold, his grip lingering on the cool brass doorknob. The study's quiet was a tangible thing, denser than the sunlit dust swirling in the air. Armitage, perched precariously on his paper-laden desk, observed him with a gaze sharp as flint, a silent dare in his eyes. Professor, Barron began, his voice even despite the nervous flutter in his stomach. The words he'd meticulously crafted in his mind now seemed fragile, inadequate under Armitage's unwavering scrutiny. There's something I need to disclose. Information you have a right to know. A mirthless chuckle escaped Armitage, a sound that scraped against Barron's composure. Pray tell. Another tale of youthful idealism gone astray, perhaps? Or have you at long last embraced the comforting embrace of cynicism? Barron entered the room fully, the familiar aroma of aged paper and tobacco clinging to his clothes. He closed the portal with a soft click, a calculated move to isolate them, to concentrate on what lay ahead. It concerns my surname, Professor.M.Y. complete designation. Armitage arched a brow, a gesture of skepticism. Indeed, if memory serves, you presented yourself merely as Barron. A touch egalitarian, wouldn't you agree? Are we about to unearth a secret lineage, a disavowed prince lurking beneath the surface? Baron dismissed the jab. He inhaled deeply, steeling himself. It's Baron Trump. The impact was immediate. Palpable. Armitage's jaw slackened. Disbelief etched on his features. The pen, previously twirling between his fingers, tumbled to the floor with a small, sharp sound. He remained motionless for a heartbeat, a statue sculpted from astonishment. His face lost all color, rendering him gaunt and strangely vulnerable. "Trump," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Did I apprehend that correctly?" Baron nodded, the simple motion feeling momentous. Tension crackled in the air, the weight of the revelation pressing down, suffocating. Armitage shoved off the desk, his movements abrupt and uncoordinated. He began to pace, hands clasped behind his back, muttering under his breath. This defies reason. Absurd. Why, how could? He halted abruptly, pivoting back to Baron, suspicion clouding his features, eclipsing the initial shock. This is some intricate jest, isn't it? Some perverse experiment in reverse psychology. You seek to what end? Illustrate a point regarding prejudice? It will avail you nothing that I am not easily swayed, Mr. Trump. He spat the name as though it were venom. Baron remained composed, though his pulse hammered in his ears. That he'd foreseen this reaction, prepared for the accusations, the incredulity. It is not a jest, Professor. It is reality. Armitage's intonation rose, his carefully maintained air of intellectual detachment shattering. Then what in heaven's name compels you to be here? In my lecture hall? In my private space? Are you monitoring my actions? Is this some political play orchestrated by your... He choked, unable to voice the name. By my father? Baron finished, his tone even. No, Professor. This has nothing to do with him. Or with politics. At least not as you perceive it. He advanced a step, diminishing the space between them. I came because I yearned to gain knowledge, because I was drawn to your convictions, your fervor, even your jaded perspective. That I wished to comprehend the world from a divergent viewpoint, to challenge my own deeply rooted principles. Armitage snorted, his countenance contorted in disdain. And you imagined you could achieve that by insinuating yourself into my existence, by feigning a persona, by capitalizing on your family's notoriety? I have capitalized on nothing, Baron countered, a flicker of anger igniting within him. I deliberately obscured my background. I desire to be evaluated on my own merits, not my lineage. That I wish to be acknowledged, not dismissed, not summarily judged. He hesitated, drawing a steadying breath, striving to regain his composure. I comprehend your response, Professor. I am aware of your sentiments regarding my family, but I am distinct from them. That I am my own individual, and I am worthy of being regarded as such. Armitage scrutinized him, his gaze probing, seeking truth within Baron's words. The initial astonishment had started to dissipate, superseded by a complex array of emotions: resentment, distrust, and perhaps a glimmer of something akin to intrigue. So, he articulated slowly, his voice regaining its edge. Permit me to clarify. You, Baron Trump, offspring of the dynasty, elected to fraternize in my unpretentious classroom, seeking illumination from a cynical academic, and you anticipate me to accept that you harbor no hidden agenda, no meticulously planned publicity effort. Baron met his gaze unflinchingly. I anticipate you to entertain the possibility that your assessment of me may be inaccurate, Professor, that your established preconceptions, your ingrained biases, may be obscuring your perception. I am not soliciting special treatment. I am requesting an equitable opportunity, an opportunity to prove myself, not as a Trump, but as a scholar, a human being. He remained steadfast, anticipating, the silence stretching, laden with unspoken inquiries and simmering anxiety. The afternoon light, now angling through the grimy panes, projected elongated, distorted forms throughout the chamber, painting the scene in hues of uncertainty and skepticism. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the revelation complete, The real reckoning about to commence, the echo chamber. It began with a flicker that a grainy photograph snapped surreptitiously across a lecture hall. Armitage's crimson visage juxtaposed with Barron's disconcertingly placid one-in audio clip, riddled with static yet undeniably capturing Armitage's impassioned voice, the name Trump, reverberating with palpable disdain. That sliver was enough to ignite everything. Within mere hours, the internet, ever the amplifier, spun conjecture into unwavering truth that a student blog, relentlessly pursuing clicks, blared. Liberal professor lashes out at Trump heir. Is academia tainted? The piece was sloppily written, littered with errors, but its message punched through. Armitage, a symbol of the entrenched left, had weaponized his position against a young, blameless Trump. Armitage stumbled upon it first on Twitter, a trending hashtag emblazoned across his feed. Hashtag Armitage the Bullied, a distorted caricature mocking his features and twisting his expression into a sneer glared back at him. A chill, sharp as winter's breath, snaked up his spine that he hadn't foreseen this escalation. He'd clung to the naive belief that the incident would remain confined within the university's increasingly porous walls. He clicked the hashtag and plunged headfirst into a deluge of censure. Appalling, this is what our tuition dollars fund. Armitage must be dismissed. He's poisoning the minds of our youth. The comments rained down, personal barbs dipped in vitriol. Scrolling, his gut twisted, he witnessed his own words contorted into weapons against him. The echo chamber roared, and he was pinned at its epicenter. Predictably, conservative media outlets seized the opportunity with fervor that a primetime segment on Fox News dissected the incident, showcasing the blurry image and looping the garbled audio that a commentator, hair lacquered into place and radiating manufactured outrage, proclaimed Armitage's behavior irrefutable proof of the pervasive anti-conservative bias infecting academia. The segment culminated with a demand for Armitage's immediate dismissal. Fanning the flames of the online furor, Armitage's phone became a buzzing torment. His department head, Professor Davies, her voice strained with barely concealed panic, summoned him urgently. "Quentin, this is delicate," she began, each word carefully measured. "The university is attracting considerable attention that we must address this swiftly." He sat opposite her, feeling strangely numb, observing her recite lines undoubtedly perfected before a mirror. "And what, specifically, do you propose, Professor Davies?" he inquired, his tone devoid of inflection. "A statement," she offered. A meticulously crafted statement acknowledging the vigorous exchange and reasserting the university's unwavering commitment to freedom of expression and civil discourse. He gave a hollow laugh. "Civil discourse. They're bang for my blood." Davies sighed, the sound deflating like a punctured lung. "Quentin, you must consider the optics that we cannot be perceived as endorsing intolerance." He understood her unspoken meaning that he was expendable. Unsurprisingly, liberal media outlets offered a counter-narrative. Articles sprung up on sites like The Nation and The Daily Beast, championing Armitage's academic freedom and denouncing the right-wing backlash as a fabricated assault. Some even lauded him for confronting the Trump agenda head-on in the classroom. One piece, headlining, "Professor Armitage, a beacon of truth in the Trump era," overflowed with lavish praise. Yet even amidst these ostensibly supportive pieces, Armitage sensed a subtle undercurrent of discomfort, a careful distancing. He was being championed, yes, but with reservations, with strategically placed caveats. He was a convenient symbol, a martyr for their cause. But his actual words, his genuine intentions, seemed inconsequential that he found himself increasingly ostracized. Colleagues who once greeted him warmly now offered only fleeting, hesitant nods. Students averted their eyes in the corridors. The university, once a sanctuary of intellectual exploration, now felt like a pressure vessel, the tension escalating with each tick of the clock. Back in his dim apartment, the laptop's glow cast long shadows across his tired features. He scrolled through the articles, the tweets, the venomous comments, feeling a deepening sense of disillusionment. He had always placed his faith in the power of reason, in the capacity of words to shape minds and reshape the world. But now, gazing into the digital abyss, he felt as though he were drowning in a torrent of noise, his own voice swallowed by the clamor of the echo chamber. He slammed the laptop shut, the sudden blackness amplifying the oppressive quiet of his apartment. He felt an eerie detachment, as if viewing his own life through a screen, a drama in which he played both protagonist and victim. He wondered what Baron Trump was thinking, what he was doing at that very moment. Was he observing the same spectacle unfold? Was he reveling in the attention? Or was he, too, a captive of the echo chamber, constrained by the expectations and biases that clung to his name? Armitage didn't know. And in that instant, he wasn't even certain he cared. He simply longed for it all to cease, trial by tenure. The summons arrived, crisp creamstock embossed with the university's imperious seal. Formal inquiry regarding professional conduct. It proclaimed, words that landed with a glacial impact on Armitage's composure. His office, usually a haven amidst overflowing shelves and nascent essays, now felt stark, a gilded cage of intellectual pride. He scanned the missive again, color leaching from his face. Legalistic phrases pirouette tauntingly before him. Infringement of ethical guidelines and possible violation of institutional protocol echoed with grim finality. They were scrutinizing him. Him, Quentin Armitage, tenured beacon of scholarly pursuit, now hauled into account for what offense? Daring to speak plainly. He crushed the paper, then meticulously smoothed it, a nervous habit hitherto unnoticed. He needed clarity, he required counsel. But from whom? His academic fellowship seemed suddenly aloof, their countenances subtly hardened after the episode. That he pictured furtive dialogues, the delicate clink of porcelain a soundtrack to their condemnation. He dialed Eleanor, his ex-wife, the singular soul who pierced his intellectual posturing and still, occasionally, dispensed a dose of reason. "Quentin, what conflagration have you ignited now?" she greeted him, her tone laced with a familiar exasperation he both resented and secretly relied on. He recounted the situation, the words tripping over each other in a scramble of outrage and anxiety. Eleanor absorbed it all in silence, broken only by infrequent sighs. "You've cornered yourself, Quentin," she declared, her voice steely. "You, in your decrees, did you sincerely expect immunity from consequence? Academic freedom is not a meaningless platitude, Eleanor," he countered, indignation hardening his voice. "It's more than a line in the university prospectus. Freedom to teach does not authorize you to broadcast every thought unfiltered, Quentin. You aren't a keyboard warrior. You're a senior faculty member. You're meant to embody leadership." Her assessment stung with truth. He'd allowed his cynicism, his disgust with the current political climate, to taint his judgment. He'd been rash, and the bill was coming due. The inquiry commenced the following week. That he faced a tribunal of stony-faced peers, formerly familiar faces now made strange by the gravity of the moment. Professor Davies, chair of the history department, emitted a dry cough. Professor Anya Sharma, a scholar of post-colonial studies, avoided his eyes. Even Professor Klein, a known champion of free expression, seemed muted, his usual fervor dampened by an unmistakable apprehension. The queries were precise, unrelenting. They dissected his comments, probed his motives, and examined his every syllable. He parried, invoking the spirit of academic liberty, the value of rigorous debate, the need to question dogma. But his defenses rang hollow, swallowed by the sterile environment of the hearing room. Beyond those walls, the university seethed. The campus paper ran an ongoing series dissecting the issue from every conceivable angle. Petitions proliferated, both championing and demanding his ouster. His colleagues, erstwhile cordial acquaintances, now sidestepped him in the corridors, their gazes skittering away upon approach. The faculty lounge, once a sanctuary of scholarly exchange, had become a treacherous landscape of veiled accusations and simmering animosity. He caught fragments of hushed conversations, gross negligence, breach of conduct, damage to the university's image. One evening, he discovered Professor Klein cradling tepid coffee in the desolate lounge. "Quentin," Klein began, his voice hushed, "I am a lifelong proponent of academic freedom. However, this departs from that ideal. You went too far." "What constitutes crossing the line, David?" Armitage demanded, his voice taut with exasperation. "The benchmark of acceptability? The standard of political correctness? Please illuminate precisely where this invisible barrier lies that I allegedly violated." "The boundary of responsible expression, Quentin. You occupy a prominent platform, an elevated position. You bear an obligation to wield that influence judiciously." Armitage scoffed. "So, I'm expected to regurgitate the approved narrative? Conform to the dominant ideology? Is that your counsel?" Klein sighed heavily. "No, Quentin.my counsel is to engage in critical self-reflection before speaking to contemplate the ramifications of your pronouncements. Remember that your words represent not solely yourself, but the institution you serve." A wave of resentment threatened to engulf Armitage, but he forced it down that he recognized the kernel of truth in Klein's assessment. He had acted recklessly. He had allowed his indignation to overcome his discretion. Yet he couldn't summon genuine regret. He stood by his sentiments and refused to recant his convictions, retreating to his office, surrounded by the silent disapproval of his library. Armitage gazed out at the darkening campus. The weight of the investigation pressed upon him, oppressive and relentless. He had dedicated his entire adult life to fostering his career, establishing his reputation. Now, all of it teetered precariously, jeopardized by a single, unfortunate statement. He couldn't help but ponder, as he had repeatedly, the perspective of Baron Trump. Was he relishing Armitage's predicament? Did he perceive him as emblematic of the liberal establishment, a target ripe for demolition? Or was he entirely detached from the situation? Was he simply another pampered youth, insulated from the consequences of his family's machinations? That notion gnawed at him, an insistent, unwelcome itch he couldn't relieve. He had summarily judged Baron Trump, dismissing him as a mere product of his milieu. But had he truly endeavored to understand him? Or had he merely succumbed to his own ingrained biases, his own unexamined prejudices? The question hung suspended, unanswered, a stark reminder of the complex, disquieting reality that now defined his existence, his livelihood, his standing, his very core, stood accused, and he remained ignorant of its resolution, the ripple effect. The campus felt altered, a subtle atmospheric change Armitage initially missed. But traversing the familiar paths, the glances he received shifted. Less respectful curiosity, more guarded appraisal. Whispers, once laced with intrigue, now held a sharper, almost condemnatory tone. It was the resonating effect of a thoughtless act, spreading outwards like rings on water. In the faculty lounge. Colleagues greeted him with strained smiles and pinched expressions. Entering departmental meetings was met with a heavy stillness, thicker than usual, broken only by rustling paper and averted eyes. Even his students, those once avid learners, seemed hesitant. Hands remained lowered during lectures, and nervous glances flickered his way as he lectured. Armitage tried to shrug it off, clinging to his detached intellectual superiority. He amplified his sarcasm, peppering his lectures with even more deliberately controversial statements, almost daring a challenge. But the bravado rang false, a fragile defense against the rising disquiet that burrowed within. He was accustomed to dispute, but this felt different. This wasn't academic jousting. It was colder, more pointed. From a remove, John Barron observed the escalating drama, a knot of unease twisting within him. He'd encountered the article, of course, the cleaned-up paraphrase of Armitage's remarks that initiated the uproar. He had even briefly smirked at the professor's temerity, the sheer force of his cynicism. Then came the university's announcement of an inquiry, unleashing an online torrent of censure that engulfed Armitage. He noticed the professor traversing the quad one afternoon. His shoulders stooped, his usual brisk walk now unsteady. A previously unseen weariness shadowed his bearing. An unexpected vulnerability. He looked diminished. The resonating impact Barron perceived threatened to engulf him entirely. He contemplated reaching out, extending some form of apology or support. But what could he possibly convey? Regret that his very existence had provoked such a response. Remorse over the professor's imprudence. The words felt flimsy, insubstantial. He was, at the core, the instigator, the unwitting architect of Armitage's predicament. The notion of intervention grew slowly, tentatively. In his consciousness, he grasped the terrible optics that he, a trump, defending a professor who had openly derided his family. It would be decried as a PR ploy, a cynical maneuver to salvage his reputation. Yet the alternative, to stand idly by as Armitage was consumed by the blaze he had inadvertently set, felt untenable. He spent the ensuing days battling his inner turmoil, pacing his room, drafting and deleting emails, arguing with his reflection. He sought counsel from no one, anticipating the inevitable critique, the accusations of ulterior motives. Ultimately, he arrived at a decision that he would neither apologize for his lineage nor condemn Armitage's words. Instead, he would champion understanding, promote dialogue, advocate for the very ideals Armitage professed. He settled before his laptop, the screen's luminescence highlighting his set expression. The cursor blinked, mocking his uncertainty. He began to write, haltingly at first, then with growing momentum and conviction. He poured his thoughts onto the screen, composing a meticulously crafted op-ed for the university's paper that he articulated the significance of unfettered expression. Even when it stung, that he emphasized the necessity of empathy. Even for those with whom we radically diverged, he elucidated the perils of stifling dissenting voices, of cultivating an echo chamber where only sanctioned opinions resonated. He refrained from naming Armitage directly, nor did he excuse his specific utterances. Rather, he centered on the broader issue of academic liberty, the entitlement to voice unpopular perspectives without fearing retribution. He posited that universities should be havens for robust debate, crucibles for the clashing of ideas. Even when those ideas proved unsettling or provocative, he concluded with an appeal for decency, for a renewed commitment to rational discourse, for a recognition of our shared humanity. Upon completion, he reviewed it repeatedly, refining each phrase, ensuring the clarity of his message. He anticipated difficulty. He braced for criticism, skepticism, even outright animosity. But he also recognized the imperative to act, that he needed to do something to mitigate the damage, to check the surge of negativity threatening to overwhelm Professor Quentin Armitage. He clicked submit, dispatching the op-ed. A voice for nuance. The campus newspaper, the University Beacon, hit the stands early that morning, and with it Barron's op-ed, titled A Plea for Nuance. It was a stark contrast to the fiery rhetoric that had dominated the news cycle. He argued not for agreement, but for understanding. That he acknowledged Armitage's remarks were insensitive, even offensive, but maintained that silencing dissenting voices, however unpopular, was a far greater threat to intellectual progress. That he called for a return to civil discourse, a willingness to engage with opposing viewpoints, and a recognition that complex issues rarely have simple answers. Armitage, hunched over a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee in his dimly lit office, was oblivious. He hadn't slept well. The faces of former colleagues, now averted in the hallways, haunted his waking hours. He felt like a pariah, his name whispered with disdain, his legacy tarnished. The playful barbs he once delivered with such relish now felt like poisoned darts, aimed squarely at his own heart. A hesitant knock interrupted his self-pity. It was Brenda, the department secretary, her usual cheerfulness subdued. "Professor, you might want to see this." She slid a copy of the Beacon across his desk, pointing to Barron's op-ed. Armitage scoffed. "More fuel for the fire, I presume." He picked it up reluctantly, his eyes scanning the headline. He almost didn't recognize Barron's name, having only ever associated him with a Secret Service detail and an aura of quiet privilege. He began to read. As he progressed through the article, Armitage's cynicism slowly began to erode. Barron wasn't defending his remarks, but the principle of academic freedom, that he wasn't condoning his behavior, but advocating for dialogue. It was a measured, thoughtful piece, a surprising display of maturity. From someone so young, and from someone he had so readily dismissed, he felt a strange stirring of something. Not gratitude, not exactly. More like a grudging respect, tinged with a disquieting sense of shame. Meanwhile, online, the op-ed was exploding. The Beacon-S website, usually a quiet corner of the internet, was buckling under the sudden influx of traffic. Social media platforms were ablaze with reactions, ranging from cautious optimism to outright condemnation. Finally, someone with some sense, one commenter wrote, "This kid gets it that we need more voices like his." "Lipstick on a pig," another retorted. "Doesn't change the fact that Armitage is a bigot. This is just PR damage control." The piece went viral, picked up by major news outlets and cable news shows. Pundits dissected Barron's prose, analyzing his motivations, questioning his sincerity. Some hailed him as a voice of reason in a polarized nation. Others dismissed him as naive, a pawn in a larger political game. The White House, predictably, remained silent. The president's Twitter feed was conspicuously devoid of any mention of his youngest son's foray into public discourse. But behind closed doors, whispers circulated about the potential fallout. Some advisors saw it as a brilliant move, a strategic attempt to soften the administration's image. Others worried it would only embolden the opposition, giving them ammunition to attack the president through his son. Back on campus, the atmosphere was palpably different. Students, emboldened by Barron's call for dialogue, began organizing impromptu debates in the quad. The air crackled with intellectual energy, a stark contrast to the tense silence of the previous weeks. Even some of Armitage's most vocal critics seemed to soften their stance, acknowledging the importance of free speech, even when it was uncomfortable. Professor Davies, a historian known for his staunchly conservative views, even stopped Armitage in the hallway. "Quentin," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I don't agree with your views, not one bit, but I respect your right to express them. And this young man's words, they've given us all something to think about." Armitage merely nodded, unable to articulate the complex emotions churning within him, that he felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped of his usual armor of sarcasm and intellectual superiority. He had always prided himself on his ability to provoke, to challenge, to expose hypocrisy. But now, he found himself on the receiving end of his own tactics, and it was far less exhilarating than he had imagined. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Armitage found himself drawn to the university quad. He stood at the edge of the crowd, listening to the impassioned arguments, the respectful disagreements, the genuine attempts to understand. He saw Barron, standing slightly apart, observing the scene with a quiet intensity. Their eyes met. For a fleeting moment, Armitage saw a flicker of something in Barron's gaze. Not triumph, not vindication, but something akin to hope. And in that moment, Armitage realized that the real test wasn't just defending free speech, but fostering a climate where genuine dialogue could flourish. And that, he suspected, was a far more difficult challenge than he had ever anticipated. The silence between them was heavy, pregnant with unspoken questions, unresolved tensions, and the nascent possibility of understanding. Reckonings. The sunlight, usually a welcome intrusion into Armitage's perpetually dim office, felt accusatory. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny representation of his own intellectual failings. He reread Barron's op-ed for the 10th time, the crisp newsprint crinkling in his trembling hand. The words, so measured and thoughtful, seemed to brand themselves onto his retinas. Nuanced dialogue, academic freedom, concepts he had championed, yet somehow, in his fervor to expose what he saw as injustice, he had trampled upon them. He'd expected outrage, maybe even a lawsuit, that he'd prepared himself for the inevitable pile-on, the predictable accusations of elitism and intolerance. He hadn't expected this. This articulate, reasoned plea for understanding, penned by the very person he had subconsciously and then consciously dismissed. Armitage pushed away from his cluttered desk, the worn leather of his chair. Groaning in protest, he paced the length of the room, the familiar scent of old books and stale coffee now tinged with a bitter aroma of self-reproach. That he stopped before the window, looking out at the campus green. Students were milling about, their faces animated in conversation. Were they talking about him? About Barron's article? He couldn't tell. That he recalled his classes, his lectures, the carefully crafted barbs aimed at puncturing what he perceived as ignorance and complacency. He'd always believed he was sparking critical thinking, challenging his students to confront uncomfortable truths. But had he merely created an echo chamber, reinforcing his own biases and alienating those who dared to hold different views? The memory of Barron's initial silence in class, followed by the quiet, polite challenges, now stung with a new intensity. He had mistaken deference for acquiescence, politeness for weakness that he'd assumed, based on nothing more than a last name and an inherited privilege. That Barron lacked the intellectual depth to engage in meaningful discourse. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture more weary than thoughtful. That he saw himself, not as the champion of truth he had always imagined, but as a caricature, a pompous academic clinging to outdated ideologies and blinded by his own self-righteousness. He'd become the very thing he railed against. That afternoon, he canceled his scheduled lecture. Instead, he walked to the student union, the very heart of campus discourse. That he found a quiet corner and sat, observing the ebb and flow of student life. He listened to their conversations, their arguments, their laughter. He tried to hear them, not as a professor dissecting their ideas, but as a fellow human being trying to understand their perspectives. The next day, Armitage walked into his lecture hall with a palpable sense of trepidation. The room was filled, the air thick with anticipation. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the microphone. "Before we begin our scheduled discussion of post-structuralism," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "I want to address something personal." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I have, in recent weeks, demonstrated a profound lack of judgment. That my words and actions, particularly concerning a member of this class, were unacceptable." A murmur rippled through the room. He saw Barron sitting in the back row, his expression unreadable. "I allowed my own biases to cloud my judgment," Armitage continued, "and in doing so, I failed to uphold the very principles of intellectual curiosity and open discourse that I claim to champion. That I owe an apology, not just to the student involved, but to all of you, for creating an environment that was not conducive to respectful and productive dialogue." He looked directly at Barron. "Mr. Trump, I sincerely apologize for my behavior. Your recent op-ed was a testament to your maturity and your commitment to academic freedom. IT has forced me to confront my own failings, and for that, I am grateful." He could feel the weight of the room's attention, the silent judgment of his students. That he braced himself for the inevitable criticism, the accusations of hypocrisy. But he also felt a flicker of hope, a sense that perhaps it wasn't too late to learn. "Moving forward," he said, his voice gaining strength, "I want to commit to fostering a classroom environment where all voices are heard, where diverse perspectives are valued, and where respectful dialogue is not just encouraged, but expected. That I will strive to be a better teacher, a better listener, and a better human being." He stopped, unsure what else to say. The silence hung in the air for a long moment, broken only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Then slowly, tentatively, a hand clapped. Another followed, and another, until the room erupted in applause. That IT wasn't universal. He noticed some faces remained impassive, some eyes filled with skepticism. But there was enough genuine appreciation to give him a sliver of hope. He looked at Barron again, and this time he saw a faint smile playing on the young man's lips. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start at a chance to begin again, bridging the divide. The email arrived mid-morning, terse and official. Subject: Case closed. Armitage investigation. The body contained only 2 sentences. After a thorough review of all available evidence, the university has determined that no further action is warranted. Professor Armitage has been cleared to resume his teaching duties without restriction. Armitage stared at the screen, a strange mix of relief and disappointment churning in his gut. He had expected, perhaps even wanted, a more definitive judgment than a condemnation he could rail against, or a vindication he could subtly weaponize. This was simply anticlimactic. The silence in his office felt heavier now, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick of the antique clock on the wall. A gift from his late father, he swiveled in his chair, the leather creaking in protest, and gazed out the window at the students milling across the quad. Life, it seemed, went on. He knew he should be grateful. His career, his reputation, hadn't been irrevocably destroyed. He hadn't become a pariah, an academic leper shunned by his peers. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge that he had, in some measure, earned the scrutiny he'd endured. A soft knock on the door broke his reverie. He sighed. "Come in." Baron Trump stood in the doorway, looking surprisingly hesitant. He was dressed casually, in jeans and a dark blue hoodie, a stark contrast to the impeccable tailoring Armitage had come to expect. "Professor Armitage," he began, his voice subdued, "I just wanted to see how you were doing." Armitage gestured to the empty chair opposite his desk. "Please sit down, Mr. Trump. Or Baron, if I may." Baron nodded, perching on the edge of the chair. "Baron is fine." An awkward silence descended. Armitage cleared his throat. "I appreciate you checking in. To be honest, I'm still processing everything." "Me too," Baron admitted. "It's been a lot." Armitage leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I owe you an apology, Baron. Not just for the things I said, but for the way I approached you, the assumptions I made. I allowed my own biases to cloud my judgment." Baron looked up, surprised. I appreciate that, Professor. But I think I understand a little bit where you were coming from. I know my name carries a lot of baggage. More than most," Armitage acknowledged with a rueful smile. "But that's no excuse for my behavior. I should have treated you with the same respect I afford any other student, regardless of your background or your family." They talked for a long time, shedding the pretense of professor and student, engaging instead as 2 people trying to understand each other. Armitage spoke of his disillusionment with the current state of political discourse, his frustration with the echo chambers and the tribalism that seemed to be tearing the country apart. He confessed his fear of becoming irrelevant, a relic of a bygone era. Baron, in turn, spoke of the pressures of living under constant scrutiny, the difficulty of forging his own identity in the shadow of his father's legacy. That he talked about his desire to be seen as an individual, not just a symbol. He revealed a sharp intelligence and a surprising empathy that Armitage had completely underestimated. Armitage realized, with a jolt, that Baron wasn't the caricature he had built in his mind. He was a young man, grappling with his own set of challenges, just like everyone else. And Armitage, in his intellectual arrogance, had failed to see it as the afternoon wore on. They found common ground in their shared concern for the future of American society. They both lamented the loss of civility, the erosion of critical thinking, the rise of misinformation. They disagreed on solutions, of course, but the very act of listening, of engaging in respectful debate, felt like a small victory. Before leaving, Baron said, "Professor, I hope this doesn't change things too much. I actually enjoy your class, even when I disagree with you. You make me think." Armitage smiled. "Thank you, Baron. That means more than you know." The following semester, Armitage introduced a new course. He called it Bridging the Divide: Empathy, Intellectual Humility, and the Art of Disagreement. The syllabus was unlike anything he had ever created. It focused not on polemics or ideological grandstanding, but on listening, on understanding opposing viewpoints, on recognizing the limitations of one's own perspective. He assigned readings for philosophers, psychologists, and conflict resolution experts. That he incorporated exercises designed to foster empathy and critical self-reflection. he encouraged students to challenge each other, but always with respect and a willingness to learn. The course was initially met with skepticism, even derision, from some of his colleagues. They saw it as a betrayal of his principles, a sign of weakness. But Armitage didn't care. He knew that he was on the right path, a path that led not to easy answers or ideological purity, but to a more nuanced, more compassionate understanding of the world. He even invited Barron to speak to the class. Barron, initially hesitant, agreed. He spoke not of politics or policy, but of his own experiences, of the importance of listening to different perspectives, of the need for empathy in a world that often seemed devoid of it. His words resonated deeply with the students, many of whom had come to the class with preconceived notions about him. Armitage watched from the back of the room, a quiet sense of satisfaction swelling within him, but he knew that he had a long way to go, that he would never be completely free of his biases. But he was trying, and that, he realized, was all that mattered. He was trying to bridge the divide, not just in his classroom, but within himself.